Um, well, it might not be readily known to all Polish audiences, but some background information on Volhynia in the interwar period. This sort of information would not be well known in certainly the American scholarship. I'm going to guess that the English scholarship more broadly also doesn't think about Volhynia all that often. After doing that, I'm going to theorize a little bit about what militarization means, particularly in borderland regions, and how militarization can function as a way to produce and induce sexual violence in areas along borders. Then I'm going to spend a really short amount of time giving an overview of Volhynia during World War II. I want to acknowledge that I am going through this history very, very quickly. Part of the reason I'm going through this history quickly is because I'm talking to a Polish audience. And I believe that for most of you, a lot of this history is going to be very well known. For an Anglophone audience, this history is very befuddling, and aside from experts in the field, the sort of ways in which Volhynia experienced World War II is not well known amongst English scholars. Then I'm going to talk a little bit through some Jewish testimony that explicates some of the themes I've been building out in the first three-fourths of my paper. And then finally, there is a short conclusion, and we'll have some time for Q&A. So that's what I hope to achieve today. Now I'm going to start with my introduction, and let's just get down to it, shall we? So on November 21st, 1928, the nationalist newspaper Gazeta Porana na Dwa Grosze ran a short story. I have the piece here on the slide. It was one buried on page 4 entitled "A Disgusting Crime." The piece details the trial of Officer Antony Karnatowski and explains how behind closed doors, Karnatowski was found guilty of a heinous crime against a 17-year-old girl while she was in the custody of, at a local police precinct in Rovna. Though unnamed, the girl is identified as an orphan of a fallen officer from the recent Bolshevik War. And as the article states, the district court in Rovna sentenced Karnatowski to 3 years in a dom poprawy. Explaining the heavy sentence, the article details that prior to Poland's independence, the Russian courts had sentenced Karnatowski to prison for a similar offense. The exact offense, however, remains unclear. Yet, reading between the lines, it would seem that Karnatowski's offense was potentially sexual in nature. So, superficially, then, this vignette is a tale of police violence and the abuse of constabulary power for sexual ends. However, if one considers the location of the crime, the broader implications can be drawn. Karnatowski's crime took place in a posterunek in Rovna, and the posterunek was no ordinary precinct. Rather, it, along with the precincts of Ostrog and Krzemieniec, served as a third line of defense of the eastern border in Volhynia during the interwar period. In this way, the local police were part of a militarized effort to protect the territory of the Second Republic. In other words, Rufna's police served as backup to the 13th Kosovo Infantry Division, stationed in Rufna. This relationship, then, between the police and the military, the border guards, then speaks to the militarization of civil authorities in the borderland region. It too hints at the bodily dangers faced by women in borderland regions, places where militaries, geopolitics, and patriarchal orders often met and clashed. Now, in this talk, I argue that sexual violence was one outcome of the militarization and warfare that took place in the Polish Ukrainian borderlands during the first half of the 20th century. I examine specific cases of militarized border sexual violence using testimony from the US Shoah Foundation. I also analyze the factors that facilitated militarized borderland sexual violence and emphasize the need to recognize this understudied aspect of nation building and ethnic violence at the margins, a process that started during the Polish Soviet War and that concluded with the see, I can't even speak English, with the deportation of ethnic Poles at the end of World War II. This is a story of chaos and of trying to make order of the chaos through violence, through police violence, military violence, and partisan violence. And at the same time, this is a story of how the bodies of civilians, of women and girls, Polish, Ukrainian, and Jewish, were made vulnerable in the process. So, in terms of Central and East European historiography, the study of the borderlands has been rather anodyne. Most of the scholarly conversation has focused on the topic of national indifference. Scholars such as Tara Zara and Jim Bjork have looked at the western borderlands of the Czech Republic and of Poland, particularly during the early part of the 20th century, and found national hybridity, if not indifference, to the national project. Now, Catherine Sancia's work uh, about Poland and Poland's eastern borderland has been more dramatic in its telling. While Sancia agrees with previous scholars that the Polish speaking peasants of this region did not readily transform into Polish nationalists, much to the disappointment of the National Democrats. She also paints the eastern border, particularly Volhynia, as riven but by violence and chaos. In other words, Volhynia became Poland's wild east. Ciencia's theory of borderlands is grounded in the physicality of the region. And because of this, she urges scholars to eschew abstraction for concrete realities. I take no issue with this approach. I look at Volhynia and I find myself wondering at the nature of um, borderlands. And I find myself also, despite Ciencia's assertions and argument, beginning to think in abstract ways. I look at Volhynia and I conceive of it as a liminal space, as a place of danger and contestation. And in so doing, I put Volhynia in conversation, not with Poland's western borderlands, but I begin to think about it in relationship to the Mexican border, the US Mexican border, and of Chicana feminism. And I turn to these areas of study for inspiration. In 1987, Gloria Anzaldúa published Borderlands La Frontera, the New Mestiza. It was a book that popularized the term borderlands as a theoretical concept. Anzaldúa conceptualized the borderlands as a psychic and as a geographical space a space wherein belonging was defined by the border itself, where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. While feminists have found analytic and liberatory richness in borderland theory, others have also interrogated the violence found in the borderlands. Increasingly, feminist and Latinx scholars have come to see the Mexican US borderland as a place of promise, as well as a locale of violence, a place typified by militarization and lawlessness. Militarization, they stress, comes with its own gendered implications. For militarized ideology is, as feminist scholars have argued, embedded with issues of hypermasculinity, patriarchy, and threats to national security. Drawing on these theoretical threads, I approach the borderlands as hostile, as a place where the marginalized did indeed bleed. And I argue that the gendered effects of militarization on the Polish Ukrainian border on women deserves further treatment. Transitioning now a little bit away from historiography into my background section. And here we're going to talk a little bit about Volhynia during the interwar period. And as I do so, I'm going to be embedding it within a broader conversation of how the region was heavily militarized during most of the first half of the 20th century. Now, national concerns over the safety of Volhynia, I argue, led to militaristic tactics that came to dominate this region during the interwar period. The voivodeship was established on 19th of February, 1921, from what had been the western part of the Volhynia Governorate of the Russian Empire. The eastern part remained in the Soviet Union. And between 1919 and 1920, Volhynia had been governed by the civil administration for the Eastern Territories. And despite the civil in this organization's title, the civil administration was largely military in its organization, one created by decree by the Supreme Commander of the Polish Army on the 19th of February, 1919. Now, having sustained heavy fighting during the First World War, Volhynia also served as the front lines of the Polish-Soviet War. And as a consequence, the region had been mired by heavy shelling. Its 1.5 million residents knew war all too well, even before the advent of World War II. In the interwar period, Volhynia remained a heavily militarized zone. Though mostly rural, its main cities tended to house state police, border guards, and active military. Lutsk, its capital city, served as home for the 24th Infantry Regiment until 1931. Other cities, including Ruvna, Kovel, Ostrog, Debno, almost all of them housed military garrisons. Proximity to the Soviet Union prompted much of this military activity, but so did the demographics. Ethnic Poles, as I'm sure you all well know, did not compromise the majority of the people living in the region. Ukrainians, or ethnic Ukrainians, in fact, comprised approximately 68% of the population, with Volhynian Jews making up the next 11%. Interethnic relations between these communities could be tense, and by the dawn of the 1930s, interethnic violence had gained momentum, with Ukrainian nationalists carrying out assassinations and Polish nationalists fomenting anti Jewish violence. Though the state entities sent to Volhynia were largely masculinist in their orientation, Warsaw viewed Volhynia in semi colonial terms, a feminine space that needed to be conquered and civilized. The region's women, meanwhile, were not well positioned to make any such political claims, as more than 60% were illiterate. Thus, even without the advent of World War II, Volhynia was a dangerous place to be a woman. The presence of the military does not necessarily militarization make. To be sure, Volhynia did have its fair share of military lying around. But militarization is also a theoretical concept. And so I want to take a moment to talk through this. In her 2000 book, Cynthia Enlow maneuvers the international politics of militarizing women's lives. She argues that in a given society, militarization involves cultural, institutional, ideological, and economic transformations. Volhynia underwent those transformations during the interwar period. In August 2014, in August 20, let's try that again. In August 1924, Prime Minister Władysław Grabski, at the request of the Minister of Military Affairs, Major General Władysław Sikorski, and the Minister of the Interior, Zygmunt Huber, established the Corps of the Military Border Guard, the KOP, for the Eastern Territories. That same month in Korea Warszawski, Sikorski informed the public that, quote, we will base border protection on strictly military principles by organizing border guard battalions within the army, which will organizationally form a corps of border guards at the disposal of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. They will perform security service in the East. The Minister of the Treasury will put at the disposal of the Minister of Internal Affairs the funds needed for this purpose. Note all of the governmental actors that were on board and needed for the KOP to function. As Sikorski's plans, which came to fruition, indicate, and as the structure of the KOP came to reveal, many levels of government were coordinated to militarize Volhynia. And so the kind of transformation that Enlow says is necessary for a zone to be militarized, Volhynia fit that definition. Initially, the KOP was charged with functions normally associated with border control. Its duties included regulating border signs and entry points, preventing illegal border crossings, combating smuggling, and cooperating with military and state authorities. Nevertheless, Soviet armed sabotage remained a preoccupation of Warsaw and of the KOP leadership. In 1929, Pilsudski issued a reform that allowed for service reciprocity between the military and the KOP. In other words, human material from the KOP could easily move into the ranks of the stationed infantry, and vice versa. To allow for this change, members of the KOP were trained alongside troops, and whatever differences existed between the KOP and the Polish military um, basically evaporated by the 1930s. Therefore, throughout the 1930s, the militaristic posture of the Volhynian borderlands only increased. And by 1938, Warsaw no longer pretended that the KOP was operating as a peacetime entity. Rather, with the inauguration of the mobilization of Plan W, Warsaw openly required the KOP to take up a wartime posture. Now, throughout the interwar period, as the geopolitical situation worsened, so too did domestic antagonisms. The resurgence of Ukrainian nationalism was a big problem for Warsaw. Starting in the late 1920s, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN, began to embrace violence as a feasible political strategy. Boycotts, arson, sabotage, and assassination became par for the course in Galicia and Volhynia in the early 1930s. The situation became so intense that in 1930, the Polish government set out to pacify the Ukrainians in eastern Galicia. Acting as Prime Minister, Pilsudski declared the arson, sabotage, assaults, and rapes of eastern Lesser Poland must not be treated as an uprising. Bloodshed should be avoided, and in the event of voluntary or involuntary support of the bombers by the population, police repression should be used, and where this does not help, military quarters. The mere presence of the army will prevent the bombers from terrorizing the population. The population must know that it has to listen to the authorities, not the bombers or the saboteurs. Consequently, I have a new one here? No, not yet. Consequently, the police, military, and KOP worked in lockstep to arrest activists, intimidate terrorists, and thwart Ukrainian political organization during the 1930 election cycle. While the campaign did not extend into Volhynia, this uptick in OUN violence forced the authorities in Lutsk to deal with civilian unrest in an increasingly militarized way. The instability in the borderlands likewise revealed that Volhynian women had more to worry about than merely state militarism. Now, nationalist militarism increasingly threatened vulnerable bodies. Thus far, I have been focusing on the increased militarization that typified Volhynia during the interwar period. And I've done this strategically because I wanted to posit the following. Volhynia during the interwar period was not exactly at peace. To be sure, peace treaties were in place, but from a sociological perspective, Volhynia was experiencing a low intensity conflict. This concept was first developed by Timothy Dunn, who defined low intensity conflict to be one wherein an unconventional, multifaceted, and relatively subtle form of militarization takes hold. Moreover, Dunn emphasizes three aspects that define low intensity conflicts. They are an emphasis on the internal defense of the nation, an emphasis on controlling targeted civilian populations, and the assumption by the military of police like and other unconventional, typically non military roles, along with the adoption by the police of military characteristics. Given these characteristics, almost all of which could be found in Poland's eastern borderlands during the interwar period, I assert that Dunn's definition of low intensity conflict is useful for considering the situation that Volhynia found itself in on the eve of the Second World War. Both outright warfare and low intensity conflict can create climates conducive to sexual violence. When low intensity conflict is visited upon a region, it often does so with the intention to control people and to squelch threats to national security. In these circumstances, sexual violence, such as the disgusting crime meted out by Officer Antony Karnatovsky, mentioned at the top of this talk, can be one outcome. Why? Because of the association between militarized rapes to power, control, and national security. Here, Cynthia Enlow is again instructive, for she has explored the three conditions under which sexual violence can be militarized. In the first instance, there is recreational rape. This outcome is born of not supplying male soldiers with adequately with an adequately accessible supply of military prostitutes. The second is that of national security rape. This Enlow configures as sexual violence used to bolster a nervous nation or state. In the third and final instance, there is that of systemic mass rape, which Enlow sees as an instrument of open warfare. Now, we know from records that many of the police and soldiers recruited to work in Volhynia were substandard, though the KOP was held in high esteem. Known for brawls, drunkenness, and desertion, the recruits were not the best and brightest Warsaw could send. However, no military or police records were kept concerning allegations of rape or sexual violence amongst the recruits, though other forms of disorderly behavior were well documented. Moreover, the secondary literature has yet to address the extent to which the Polish military provided sexual comfort to its soldiers. Not a topic the military historians have thus far taken up. Though it should be stressed that following the conflicts of both the First World War and the Polish-Soviet War, Volhynia was awash with orphans, young victims like that of Antony Karnatovsky's. The opportunities for sexual trade and sexual violence were likely high. Unfortunately, scholarly treatments of prostitution in the interwar period have tended to focus on Warsaw. Hence, there is no easy way to assess whether recreational rape was prevalent in Volhynia, though the conditions were ripe. Regarding national security rape, the evidence is almost as shaky. Pilsudski, for instance, as we saw, accused the OUN of rape. Meanwhile, Ukrainian sympathizers accused the KOP of rape. Crime statistics from the era are not particularly useful. Neither Tsarist law nor the Penal Code of 1932 enthusiastically condemned sexual predators. Rather, women who had fallen victim to such crimes were pressured into keeping quiet, and should they have wanted justice, they would have had to apply to the state to prosecute, something an illiterate populace was not likely to do. Finally, there is the case of systemic mass rape. Nothing from the interwar period suggests that Volhynian women were particularly prone to state-sanctioned systemized rape. However, following the start of World War II, the likelihood that mass rape descended upon the region does, in fact, go up. Thus far, I have configured interwar Volhynia as a borderland, as a place of militarization, marginalization, and sexual vulnerability. The Second World War only intensified these trajectories. In the Anglophone world, the nuances of the Polish experience of World War II are often glossed over. For Volhynia, the complexity is more than most English speakers can bear. Rather than being a war of Nazis and Soviets, Volhynia's war was one plagued with civil war and ethnic cleansings, all against the backdrop of the Holocaust and later the German expulsions. To paint the quickest of pictures, on the 17th of September 1939, Łódź, the capital city of Volhynia, fell to the Soviets. Consequently, the region was annexed into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Hundreds of thousands of Polish citizens, both Jewish and non-Jewish, were forcibly displaced to Siberia and Kazakhstan. In 1941, in the early stages of Operation Barbarossa, the NKVD emptied the Volhynian prisons, executing almost all of the prisoners. Thousands of people, mostly Ukrainians, but also Poles, were killed. Soon after the Soviets withdrew from the region, the Nazis entered. As they did so, they stirred up anti Semitic sentiment amongst the local Ukrainian population, precipitating pogroms across the region. Between 1941 and 1944, most of Volhynia came under German occupation as part of the Reichskommissariat Ukraine. The Nazis, with the help of the local population, particularly the Ukrainian police, murdered almost all of the local Jewish population. By the end of 1942, the region was effectively Judenfrei. In late 1943, tensions between the Ukrainian and Polish populations reached a head as units from the Ukrainian insurgent army carried out mass murders against Polish civilians. Eventually, Lutsk was delivered from the hands of the Nazi forces on the 2nd of February 1944. Kovel was not reoccupied by the Red Army until 1940, July 1944. Western Volhynia, as most of you know, never returned to Polish administration, and after World War II, almost all ethnic Poles were evicted from the eastern borderlands. Few Jews survived. At each stage of Volhynia's wartime history, evidence of rape and sexual violence were recorded. Assessing the extent thus far seems to be a bit of a fool's errand. Yet it was Volhynia's borderland nature that made the region's civilians particularly vulnerable. Ethnic resentments flared as great armies moved through the region. As armies, police, and partisans um, moved through the area, they brought with them an embedded sense of hypermasculinity and patriarchy. They too felt a heightened threat to national security. And as all of this unfolded, the gendered effects of militarization were visited upon the bodies of the women of Volhynia. Moving sort of into my last area. To be sure, Polish and Ukrainian women lived in Volhynia, but no group was more marginalized than that of the Jews. Taking an intersectional approach, Jewish women sat at the crossroads of misogynistic and anti Semitic bias. For that matter, every militarizing force that entered the region looked upon the Jews as other. Consequently, there was no safe place for Jewish women in the shifting power structure. But some places and some periods were more dangerous than others. Nazi administration of Volhynia served as the greatest threat to Jewish life. Yet, even if a Jewish woman were able to escape the Nazis, Polish, Ukrainian, and Soviet partisans were almost always lurking. In this way, the borderlands became especially treacherous for Jewish life. The extremity of the Jewish experience in the extraordinary sexual vulnerability that Jewish women endured thereby speaks to the sexual danger presented by the Volhynian borderlands. Consequently, we're now going to meditate on two case studies, probably going to do it very quickly based upon where our time is at, that shed light on the multi-leveled sexual vulnerability experienced by Jewish women in Volhynia during the war. So, when I initially laid out this topic, I wanted to bring together 5 separate testimonies. But because of time and because of my own exhaustion, I narrowed it down to 2. And in my paper, I really explicate the different types of violence that both of my interlocutors experienced. I highlight these 2 women and their testimonies because, on the one hand, they all came from the Volhynia region. I also chose these particular testimonies because they shed light on the fact that these women were subjected to bodily violence and sexual vulnerability, not merely by Nazi and Soviet forces, but also by the partisans in the region. And both of these women speak to the dangers of both the Polish and Ukrainian forces that these women encountered when they were in hiding, and the ways in which, they had to deal with their bodies under siege through the regular um, military shifts in the region, and then through the added layer of the Holocaust, so from the pogroms in 1941 and the kinds of terrors that they experienced in ghetto life, to escaping the ghetto, largely in hiding in woods and some in different um, friends' houses, and in hiding, then having to be additionally terrified by the nationalist partisan activity in the region. So one such person that I looked at was that of Mina Snochowski, and she was particularly concerned with the ways in which she found the Ukrainian partisans quite troublesome in her experiences of the war. The other person I looked at was that of Polar GRINSTEIN. There are other testimonies that I looked at it as well. She was particularly um, held animus, not just for the Ukrainian forces, but also for the Army Krajova, in which she saw both as being very, very dangerous to Jewish survival, Jewish bodily integrity, and uh, both entities were dangerous in terms of organizing, she says, organizing rape in the region. I gave both of them very short shrift. I do apologize. So I want to now arrive at some concluding ideas. So in this paper, I wanted you to meditate on 4 ideas: that gendered violence was embedded in the borderland regions, that the relationship between militarization and sexual violence was actually quite particular to many borderlands, and that interwar and wartime Volhynia served as an example of these phenomena. And that finally, that Jewish Volhynian voices serve as particularly illustrative of the gendered violence that stalked the borderlands. Now, to be sure, my ideas remain inchoate, kind of vague. Nevertheless, much has been made about gendered violence that can be found in the contemporary US Mexican border. But what if we transport these theoretical innovations to the Kresy, to Volhynia, to Galicia? What new and interesting histories might we uncover? With that, I want to thank you for your attention, and we can now try to make a Q&A happen. Let's make it work.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Megan, very much for this interesting talk. I encourage everyone now to ask their questions. You can ask them in, przepraszam, teraz przejdę już na polski. Możecie Państwo pisać swoje pytania w języku polskim albo w języku angielskim, jakkolwiek jest Państwu wygodniej. Można też zgłosić do mnie chęć zabrania głosu, wtedy ja udostępnię taką możliwość. A teraz, korzystając z okazji, sama zadam pierwsze pytanie. So going back to Megan and switching to the English,
Mhm.
being the privileged, I will start with the first question.
Of course.
And this is not the topic that you covered during today's talk,
Mhm.
but I was wanting to ask, I think, two questions, more from the perspective of the victims of these
Yeah.
horrible rapes. Do you know if there were any kind of actions that women were able to undertake to escape the rape? Because I remember my grandmother
Mhm.
stories from the end of the Second World War, that when the Red Army was approaching her village, women were, of course, hiding, but they also were wearing very bad clothing, and
Mhm.
all trying to use kind of camouflage to become less attractive for the soldiers. And the second question is about the perspective on or how the children that were from the rapes, how they were, I don't know how to say it, how they were treated by the society. Do you have
Okay.
any insight on that?
Yes. Okay. So I'll treat the first question first, largely because I have better insights on this. Um, from so I too have engaged with the sources that talk about the strategies Polish and German women used to avoid garnering the attention of the Red Army in 1944, 1945. Jewish women did not necessarily have to you could not necessarily use all of those strategies. Most of the time, most of the instances by which they became most sexually vulnerable, and this is sort of in the stages of ghettoization before the eventual executions. We are talking about a population that at that point had been essentially starved, that had very poor access to sanitation. And by most conventional standards, these women wouldn't have met, templates of attractiveness. We definitely can see that in some of the testimonies when females that are being raped are children or elderly, you know, surely there may have been some sexual gratification that were happening in these instances, but it seems that power was mostly at play. That being said, women in hiding tended to, in my readings, tended to do one of three things. There were those women who tried to find and carry with them weapons. So, in one of the testimonies not included in this talk, this one woman explains how she spent years in the forest, moving from place to place continuously so that she wouldn't be located, and how she carried a knife with her at all times so that if bandits, Ukrainian or Polish, came upon her, she was armed. So this constant desire to keep moving as a form of safety and to carry weaponry was definitely employed by some people. Other women talked about trying very hard to rely upon their pre-war relationships. This is Jewish women, their pre-war relationships, normally, and this was in cities, with Polish friends, and how women sort of created these networks. And I don't want to like blow this up to make it a more important thread than what it was, but sort of a solidarity of women where Polish women would hide Jewish women. They would keep that knowledge hidden from their husbands. And this often created a kind of safety for the Jewish women in hiding. This became more problematic in 1943 during the Volhynian massacres because the safety of the Polish house and the Polish housewife was essentially destroyed. So that strategy was also used. And I think there's probably much more research that could be done, similar to Marion Kaplan's work in Germany about the relationships Polish Jewish women had with non-Jewish women as a strategy for survival. Um, the last thing I can touch upon is that in addition to these strategies, Jewish women would try to find in the woods Jewish partisans. Most of the time, these were communists, but that became a kind of fraternal or a kind of social way that Jewish women could become protected by Jewish men. Now, I don't have any testimonies to indicate that, this was foolproof as a way to keep women safe. And the research by Marta Havrushko of how women operating in the Ukrainian partisan forces leads me to believe that even if the partisan forces kept women safe from enemy forces, the partisans themselves weren't necessarily safe havens. So there were these sorts of strategies. At the end of the day, all of these strategies, we are talking about something that is statistically an anomaly because what 1.5% of the Volhynian Jewish population survived. So every person who survived is a statistical outlier, and the strategies they used are statistical outliers. So it's hard to draw sort of larger sociological conclusions. But these are some of the things I have seen. Regarding the products of rape, this is a topic I don't actually know much about in either the Jewish or the Polish contexts. There, there has definitely been more work and greater emphasis on the kind of gynecological reports that came out of East Germany at the end of World War II. Again, anecdotally, a under extreme duress, the female body doesn't necessarily tend to become pregnant and produce children, though we, of course, have examples of, again, outliers of women who did become pregnant and gave birth to children. Often these children didn't survive. Um, we don't know the exact demographics on any of this, but the survival of children within the babies, neonates, in the Polish area between 1939 and 1945 seems to have been extraordinarily low, even amongst the non-Jewish population. Some of these babies were, again, anecdotally, um, either stillborn or left to die, largely because crying babies required food and could cry and give away someone's hiding position. Um, all of this, though, to me is highly, highly anecdotal. And if people know of a repository of testimony that talks more about this and about those children who did in fact survive, I mean, I know of a handful of testimonies from Jewish survivors who were the product of Jewish and Nazi um, sexual encounters. But if there is a broader cache that looks specifically at Volhynia, I would be thrilled to look at it.
Okay, thank you for your answers. We are still waiting for questions. Nadal czekamy na Państwa pytania. And then meanwhile, while we are waiting, hopefully there will come some. Is there anything that you wanted to add to the topic and didn't have time so far to say?
I mean, I think the thing that I think it's less about what I didn't have time to say and more about what I want for the topic. So right now, I have been using largely Showa videograph sources Why? Because those are what are easiest for me to get when I have an extra minute and I want to look at testimony. I need to, and I need to go to GIF. I need to look at the post-war testimonies to comb through to find those moments where the post-war testimonies talk about violence in the region. Again, we're talking about a very small number of people, but I think that having that testimony would make my position stronger, and I'd like to put them in conversation with uh, post-war Polish and hopefully someday, should the archives ever become accessible again, Ukrainian sources, so that we can really get
Mhm.
a full-fledged picture of Volhynia, of the Kresy as a region that was dangerous to women because of militarization throughout most of the first part of the 20th century, and that World War II becomes like this apex of violence. So yeah, I guess I want this to be an embedded story. It's not
Yeah.
just a story about Jewish women, but of the
Mhm.
women of the region.
Yeah. It was also very really interesting for me this comparison between Volhynia and the Mexican border.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is really a very interesting thread, and I'm really waiting for your conclusions, like, more
Yeah,
specific on that.
I feel like in there is a lot that I think American scholarship in terms of ethnic and racial violence and sexual violence is actually really well developed. And the feminist scholarship often focuses on ethnic minorities, whether it be Latino or African American. And I think some of the ways they think through these scholars think through these problems and the ways they use sources. Because if we're talking about enslaved women in the United States, these are women that didn't leave a lot of sources. And if we look at Volhynia, Volhynia is a place that, yes, sources exist, but sources from illiterate women are not as prevalent. And so those kinds of strategies that US scholars use can be, in my experience, really fruitful for thinking through some of the problems we face with evidence in the interwar and World War II Poland.
Yes, and I think also what may be the big challenge in the Jewish post-war testimonies is that the issue of the rape wasn't really discussed very broadly or even mentioned.
Yes.
So yeah, that's
I mean, both in the interwar period and then in the immediate post-war period. And now I just recently wrote a paper up on this. Like, there was culturally in the interwar period um, an impulse to not prosecute rape and to cast women who talked about rape as crazy or hysterical, or to cast them as vengeful, and to only and those who talked about being raped or wanted to pursue it were seen as being somehow perverse. And so rape as a crime was not heavily dealt with by the state prior to World War II. And so the law codes obviously were produced by a society that wanted to keep these crimes quiet, and then the law further kept these crimes quiet, and we see that continuation, um, those sort of desires to about thinking of rape as shameful, as a as something that hurt one's honor and purity. We see that continuing after the war. It's a real threat of continuity that happens for both non-Jewish and Jewish women in the late 1940s. And then the people who arrive in Israel have added layers of shame that are placed upon them largely because the Sabra often would ask the survivors, particularly women, what did you do in order to survive? So there was this further shaming that took place and silencing.
Yes, that's true. I'm looking to the chat, and there are still no questions. So I think we will wrap up the meeting. Megan, thank you very much. It was for me very interesting talk, and I really learned a lot.
Oh, wonderful!
And your conceptualizations are really very interesting for me, and I think I'm going to go through the your PDF again.
Okay, wonderful.
To learn more. And dziękuję Państwu bardzo za uwagę. Zapraszam Państwa na seminarium, które odbędzie się w przyszłym tygodniu, 17 stycznia o godzinie 11, jak zawsze. Naszym gościem będzie dr Dominik Flisak i będzie on mówił o malarzu Jakubie Steinhardzie. Dziękuję, że dzisiaj za uwagę, za Państwa czas i do zobaczenia za tydzień. Do widzenia. Thank you, Megan, again.
Thank you.